What up, space babies? What I'm about to disclose is the answer to the most important question we face today. How do we make revolution? Now the answer is so simple it might make you shrug. But behind its simplicity lies a complex theory, so join me in this journey from the simple to the complex to the simple again. And in this experience, we'll both have been transformed. You've seen the title, you know the answer. Go ahead. How do we make revolution? By using the mass line. The mass line is the measure by which we judge all past, present, and future revolutions. Seriously, it's that big a deal. Now, of course, there's much more to making revolution than just the mass line, but without the mass line, no successful revolution. Now, in order to get where we need to go, let's establish a couple of things. 1. The mass line is a method of leadership. This means that there are those who lead and those who are led. No leaders, no mass line. 2. The mass line has to be used by an organization. If you go out there and you're lonesome, you will not make it. Now, in my cute little humble opinion, the mass line only leads to revolution if it is used by a revolutionary party. But to all my anarchist comrades out there, keep watching. A lot of ANCOMs still hold their need to be leaders in a movement, just no revolutionary party. This means you're still going to deal with the contradiction between leaders and followers, which I'll be talking about. 3. I don't mean leaders and followers in any condescending way. One isn't better than the other. There's a dialectic between the two, which means there's a unity of opposites. And you know what that means, kids? Yep. One turns into the other. The leaders become the led, and the led become the leaders. And the leaders in this sense know a tad bit more than the led. They're just like one chapter in front of the led, not a whole textbook. With these things established, let's get fucking busy. Whenever you have a problem within a political system, let's say you can't afford rent, there are two avenues for change. You can fight to either change the system from within, or you overthrow the whole thing. Reform or revolution. At the beginning of your political development, chances are that you're gonna choose reform. The line of thinking is rarely, I can't afford my rent, down with the whole fucking system. Instead, the line of thinking usually goes something like, I can't afford my rent, so we should have rent control. Because technically it appears to make sense, right? If you're facing a problem, shouldn't the method of solving it be the quickest and easiest? From this we can draw that for the masses, in a non-revolutionary situation, reforms will be more appealing than revolution. Shit, if revolution was on top of mind for everybody, I'd be fucking chilling under communism right now, and that is far from what is happening. So let's say you fight for rent control, but you don't achieve your goal. Okay, that sucks, but what do you do now? Do you turn your back on reforms in general? Do you now see that reforms are just a concession granted by the bourgeoisie and can be taken back at the flick of a fat capitalist finger? Probably not. You're more likely to just go on to the next one. Okay, maybe we didn't get lower rent, but we could do something about police brutality or get higher wages or whatever the fuck. So let's establish some more main points here. 1. The masses will fight for reform spontaneously. 2. Fights for reforms usually fail. But we gotta add another super important layer. 3. We don't always learn from personal experiences. And when we do, we don't always learn what we should. What does it mean to learn from the fight for failed reform? I should have brought a better megaphone, worn more comfortable clothing, or we just need more people next time? Without some sort of intervention, this can go on indefinitely. And this is because generally, based on your own personal experiences within capitalism, you're not likely to adopt a revolutionary perspective on your own. So I'm not talking about what you read or who you talk to or what you watch or whatever. I'm talking simply about what you learn from your own lived experiences. And this isn't just because it's hard to draw the right lessons from our own experiences, but it's also because it can take decades before you recognize the cycles of how reforms are granted and taken back. Think about it. If you're not familiar with radical history, then it's really easy to see reforms as a line of progression. It leads to a very vague theoretical framework. We, and who knows what we means in this instant, have more rights now than we did back in the day, so we just gotta be patient, that's all. Things are getting better, slowly, but surely. Now, of course, nobody's a blank canvas. In fact, as we'll see later, most of our knowledge comes from outside of our own lived experiences. And when it comes to our own lived experiences, well, all practice is rooted in an ideological framework. Nobody acts on pure feeling alone. There's some mode of thought motivating you. So that begs the question, where do the masses get their theory from? From a myriad of ideological sources, of course. Speeches studied in school and history class, movies, popular novels, rap music, conversations with friends, etc. Most ideological sources in a capitalist society are going to point to reformism. If they didn't point to anything, class struggle would be blown out of proportion. The lid has to be lifted a little to take off pressure. So of course the answer most people have is going to be tied to reforms. Which means that for most people, their own lived experiences point to reform, direct knowledge, and so do the things they learn about, indirect knowledge. But here we are, you and me. We operate from a different mode of analysis. We know about revolutionary theory, so our practice should be looking different, right? But how do we get to that point? Luck! Sheer fucking luck. We're nothing special. We were just lucky enough to be exposed to revolutionary theory. Now, once you're exposed to it, once you're introduced to the Marxist method of analysis, you can take it anywhere based on your own experience. But there has to be that point of contact first. Let's say the first thing you picked up randomly was a book from Mao, which means you're extra lucky, by the way. Where did Mao get his information from? He didn't make revolution out of nowhere. He was introduced to Marxism through the May 4th movement, which in turn put into practice what they'd learned from the Russian Revolution. Now, Soviet revolutionaries put into practice what they'd learned from revolutionary intellectual circles, and these were led by people who had directly encountered Marx and Engels. So where did Marx and Engels get their theory from? By putting into practice what a whole bunch of motherfuckers had learned through philosophy, as well as labor movements of their time. Marx was lucky enough to have encountered Hegel and to have been in London at the time of the First International. Now, of course, just that first point of contact, the introduction to revolutionary theory, isn't enough. But just so what is the connection between theory and practice? Where does knowledge come from? Well, philosophers have tried to find out the answer to this question for fucking centuries. The answer? Practice. Okay, so if knowledge comes from practice, how does it develop? Through the following seesaw. Practice, theory, practice. You start off by doing some shit. Let's say you fry up some tofu. Well, in order to learn anything about frying up tofu, first you have to do it. Or as Mao said, to learn about a pear, you have to take a bite first. Okay, you fried up your tofu, but you didn't chop it up, dehydrate it, or season it. You eat it and it tastes like shit. Then comes the theoretical part. Why did it taste like shit? Well, since other food needs seasoning, tofu probably needs some too. Maybe if you chop it in cubes, it'll fry more evenly. And if you dehydrate it, there'll be no excess liquid to tamper with the frying process. Now, if you would leave it at that, your whole experience would be meaningless. All you would have learned to do is how to make shitty tofu. After all, who's to say that the theory you gathered from your practice is correct? That's why step 3 is essential. You take your theory and revise your practice. After putting it to use, your theory has been proven correct and you have delicious protein and calcium. To summarize it in more detailed terms, the Marxist theory of knowledge goes a little something like this. 1. Stage of perception. 2. Stage of synthesizing the data of perception, rational stage. 3. Stage of applying and testing the knowledge in practice. And think about what your theory was based on. Chemistry and past cooking experiments. But what was this knowledge based on? Did you whip up a million meals just to come up with the science of cooking? Theory, of course, doesn't just come from our own practice, but that of collective mankind. Direct knowledge and indirect knowledge. I know how to mummify somebody. I really don't know why I came up with this example, because I've never done it. But I'm sure I could go on YouTube and watch a shit ton of videos on how it's done, and if I'd really want to, put it into practice. Why? Because a couple thousand years ago, some Egyptians did exactly that. But just watching videos doesn't get me there all the way. In order for me to fully understand, I need to do it. I need to mummify somebody. So I need both. I need past experience, but I also need to put that past experience into practice myself. Only then will I have deeper and stronger appreciation from the knowledge of the past. Now, this point is so important. We need to put something in practice in the present to understand the practice of the past. And of course, my point is that this applies to class struggle too. You can't fully understand past struggles without participating in a contemporary one. Let's take the greatest bromance in the world, Marx and Engels. They observed the practice of laborers organizing for reforms, as well as how capitalism transformed society. They weren't distant, detached observers, however. They partook in labor and revolutionary activism too. They took this practice and analyzed it through the lens of dialectical materialism. The proletariat then took this theory and applied it for the first time successfully by establishing the Paris Commune. This was step 3, putting the theory into practice. Now Marx and Engels in turn learned from the Paris Commune. They took the time to analyze it in light of the theory they'd already established. Here they found that they needed to revise it, namely that the proletariat can't use the bourgeois state for its own purposes, but has to establish a new worker state. What happened after the Paris Commune were countless attempts at revolution. Some were successful and others weren't. The successes and failures were analyzed, and on this basis the theory updated. That's why it makes sense for the body of theory you're working with to have taken all past revolutions and lessons into consideration. And for me, MLM all day. And this is how theory will always continue to develop. So how can we tie this to what we talked about in part 1? Well, there are people who have lots of personal experience with class struggle, but who stay stuck in a reformist framework. Because their second step, their theoretical stage, is a reformist one. Remember, that's the basis you continue your next course of action from. Now they need summarized revolutionary experience to transform their practice. On the other side, there are people who know every intimate fucking detail of the history of class struggle and revolution. These are people who don't need a lot of personal experience with class struggle to understand the need for revolution. But the biggest pitfall here is when this amazing knowledge people have never gets put into practice. Which if you really think about it, these people never even get to step 1. It's a sad thing. Taking it back to the bigger picture, the masses must, to some degree, learn the need for revolution through their own experience and reformist struggle. But they also need to be presented with a framework with which to sum up their own experiences. The tension between both these sides is resolved by the part 3. The mass line. The mass line parallels the 3 steps of Marxist epistemology. Remember, the study of knowledge. For the mass line, the 3 steps look like this. An organization gathers the scattered and unsystematic ideas of the masses, concentrates these ideas into a correct line capable of advancing the revolutionary struggle, takes this line back to the masses, propagates it broadly and persistently, and leads the struggle on this basis. Notice in step 2 how the ideas are concentrated into a line. This is of course really important, but what is meant by a political line? You can see it as a political position that will then be linked to an action. For example, if you're upholding a line of anti-electoral politics, it means that theoretically you see electoral politics as a dead end, which in practice then leads you to not go out canvassing for local politicians. That's all political line is, an idea which results in a specific political action. So what's the goal of the mass line? Well, it's to organize the masses and raise their consciousness from capitalism to communism. Think about it. If everyone on this planet right now operated from a communist framework, we'd all reorganize society in a week. But unfortunately, that's not how ideology works. What we've learned from the Soviet and Chinese revolutions is that class struggle continues throughout socialism, and you need multiple cultural revolutions to carry the revolution all the way through. This happens most successfully wherever the masses have taken communist consciousness as their own. The mass line already starts this process before the working class seizes power. So let's examine the mass line step by step. The mass line takes the ideas of the masses as a starting point. Why do we start there? Well, if you take seriously that the masses are the makers of history, that they're the ones who push history forward, well, then it only makes sense that they have the ideas on how to do that. If not the masses, then who the fuck? Most shit in the world that happens on a day-to-day basis is carried out by the masses. So when it comes to immediate questions on how to solve them, it only makes sense that the people who do it know how to fix it. Emphasis on immediate questions. So you go out into a neighborhood and you just fucking talk to people. What do they think their immediate problems are? Where do they think these problems stem from? Now these ideas are either going to be correct or incorrect. During the first stage of the mass line, it's very important to listen to the wide variety of ideas the masses have. Some people are gonna have some wild fucking ideas about a whole bunch of shit. But regardless of what you think about what they say, at this point, just take it all in and get down to the root. Ask them for their reasoning behind what they say. Now, if you pay close attention, you'll notice that in step 1, it doesn't just say gather the ideas of the masses. It specifically says gathering the scattered and unsystematic ideas of the masses. So why are the ideas of the masses scattered and unsystematic, and what the fuck does that mean? Well, coming up, writing down, and refining a theory that deals with an analysis of capitalism and how to resist it, well, that shit takes a whole lot of time and energy, especially if you're starting from scratch. So if you've never been given the theory to help you out, small chance that you're gonna come up with a coherent system of thought on your own. It's not that people aren't reflective or don't think about the shitty conditions of their work. A lot even have great points of analysis about the system they live in and what should be done about their problems. But it just takes an extra step to translate that to a coherent theory. Time that capitalism purposefully doesn't give most of us. And then you gotta deal with all this bourgeois ideology indoctrinating you every day. And then as a worker, you're forced to compete with other people in the workplace, which also influences your ideas, and it's just bad, man. Well, but don't get pessimistic. All this shit can be overcome through organization. Revolutionary Party. Now, within the masses, there are different classes, world outlooks, education levels, interests, yada fucking da. You're gonna have people that are advanced when it comes to certain issues and backwards when it comes to others. So these are some of the reasons why the ideas of the masses are scattered and unsystematic. Now keep in mind, these are general tendencies, alright? The masses generally might not operate from a revolutionary framework, but there are certainly sections within the masses that can develop a revolutionary outlook on their own. Okay, so let's sum up what we learned about step 1 so far. You're gonna hear both correct and incorrect ideas. It's important to hear out both and listen to the reasoning behind them. Don't expect to hear revolutionary theory, but be on the lookout for revolutionary tidbits. So after talking to a whole bunch of fucking people, you're gonna narrow it down to one specific problem that the majority of the people you talk to felt concerns about. Now what this is, of course, depends on a lot of factors. Where are you organizing? What's the situation? Is there any way you can advance the situation? Is their problem more prominent than others? And how do the masses see this? Whatever problem you hone in on, every time you talk to the masses about it, they should feel it in their hearts. Your goal is to solve this problem. And after you've narrowed your social investigation down to one problem, you start collecting ideas again. These could be concrete proposals for actions, but also just random shit that pops into people's heads that they think about. Write down the positive and the negative. What makes them embrace something? What doesn't? Don't expect people to open up to you about everything right away. To successfully implement the mass line, you need to stay close to the masses. To strengthen and deepen bonds. The more they trust you, the better you can implement the mass line. The better you can implement the mass line, the more they trust you. As an organization, you need to be in it for the long haul. How long? However long it fucking takes. Here's a delicious mouth quote of how we got to his analysis of the Hunan peasant movement. I spent 10 years before and after the land reform program. I could not have done it without the 10 years. During the Great Revolution, I held 2 lecture and study sessions on the peasant movement, one in Guangdong and one in Wuhan, and did some investigation and study, but still did not have a solution. Only later, when I carried out investigations in Xingguo and other regions and investigated Changgang Township and Saiche Township, could I solve the problem. The masses taught it to me. They told me how to do it. Congratulations, you made it to step 2. Now you've gathered some wonderful and not so wonderful ideas of the masses. Which of these ideas are going to lead us to sweet juicy revolution? And which lead to us losing power and forever licking slimy boots of dirty politicians? AKA, which ones are correct and incorrect? What helps with this filtering process is to think these ideas through. If these ideas are put into practice, if they're to be the basis for action by the masses, what will that lead to? To do this successfully, we need Marxist theory and take the objective conditions into account. This is why theory is so fucking important. This is the basis you use to judge whether a line advances proletarian revolution or not. Now before you get all excited and pick the political line where we all hit the streets ready to go right fucking now, keep the following in mind. The mass line is a tool that should be used to advance the current situation. This is what is meant by meeting the masses where they are. So that's the basic mass line position. Now this is opposed by two extremes. One extreme would be to do what the majority of the people want to do just because it's simple. That will be to discard Marxist theory. Remember, most people operate from a reformist framework, so correct ideas generally come from the minority. Again, if most people shared the ideas that would propel revolution forward, we'd be there already. On the other hand, there can be a tendency to think that the masses don't have any good ideas. That correct ideas can only come from an anti-capitalist organization. This is a bourgeois view of leadership that says that the masses can think of correct ideas but only grasp them. We have to keep this in mind at all times because it's so easy to forget. We're not trying to come up with the next 10 concrete steps for a revolutionary strategy, just the next one. But now comes your greatest fear, the question that has been in your mind the whole time. What if you can't find any ideas that can advance the current situation? Well, it means one of two things. One, we haven't investigated the ideas of the masses sufficiently. Two, we're looking for ideas among the masses which aren't appropriate to advance the current situation. If you go around asking the masses on how to organize a general strike, you might be disappointed just because the level of consciousness isn't there. But if instead you'd ask people how to deal with rising rents, you'll be surprised with how many great ideas you'll hear. So keep these two things in mind. Don't disregard the role Marxist theory plays in filtering the ideas of the masses, but also don't just pick out the ideas you already agree with. Challenge yourself. This is it, y'all. We finally made it to the last step of the mass line. We gathered the ideas of the masses, cool. We filtered them through a revolutionary framework, picked out correct ideas and discarded the worthless. Now we shaped this into a juicy political line and, most importantly, we then returned this back to the masses. This is where we put our hypothesis to the test. We picked out what we think are the correct ideas and presented back to the masses in the form of a political line. Because if we don't do this, well, we can just shout about correct theory all day, but only practice proves which theory is correct. Now, of course, first the line has got to be discussed within whatever organization you're at. The smaller the org, the easier this is. Everybody who implements the mass line has to understand and grasp it. You can have your doubts, that's cool, but once you're out there, you gotta be with it with full passion. And if you disagree with the line so much that you can't even fathom going out there and talking to people about it, well, then you should probably rethink your position within the organization. After you discuss the line internally, you then discuss it externally with the masses. You explain it to them until they fully understand how the line will solve a problem they have or how it can achieve a goal they're wishing to achieve. Remember Mao spending 10 fucking years for the right implementation of his analysis? Yeah, you might have to explain some shit over and over again. Keep relating it to their experiences. If you find it impossible to do this, there might be a little problem with your line. At this point, you try to win over as many people as possible. The more people you can get behind it, the better the chances of success for the line. Don't expect people to just be down from the get-go. Remember, there's gonna be lots of pushback. It's generally only a minority of the masses that are down with the ideas of the advanced. And everybody deals with internal conflicts. Some people might be down in the beginning and waver off later. Some people might stand on the sideline at the beginning, but join up later. So after you implement the line, you're either gonna achieve your goal or you don't. If your line was successful, great. Use it to elevate consciousness and expand organization. And after that, on to the next one. And if you fail, back to the drawing board you go. But it's not always this clear cut. You might not always be 100% successful or have failed 100%. Sometimes you achieve partial successes. Again, you have to analyze why. Remember, you always go from practice to theory and theory to practice. Maybe you thought you were tackling one goal, but in reality, you were tackling multiple at a time. And if that's the case, which goal was achieved? The main goal? A minor one? Was good. Last note, a line is never completely a failure, because by implementing it, you'll have learned new things and the masses will have learned new things. But it's tricky, y'all. Shit is real fucking tricky. At what point do you call it quits and go back to the drawing board? At what point do you keep pushing? Why did a line fail? Was it implemented half-heartedly? How much should you adjust and shift? And if you go back to the drawing board and fail again, why? Maybe you're not drawing the correct lessons from it. Maybe you need a stronger theoretical foundation in step 2. Mastering the mass line is an art, something that those of us in the Imperial Corps have a shit ton to learn about. I'm far from an expert on the mass line, but the great thing about it is the more you do it, the better you get at it. So go out and do it. There it is, the special sauce of revolution. Whenever you have a complex task at hand, you'll need people in leadership positions to coordinate things. The mass line to me is the only method of leadership that faces that contradiction between the leaders and the led head on. That's because the method not only teaches the masses, but teaches the leaders how to teach the masses. The leaders are led because they learn how to lead and where to lead by the masses. The leaders in turn solve the contradiction between the masses' need for revolution and their present failure to recognize the need. Using the ideas of the masses as a basis, they're then returned until they embrace them as their own. Cause guess what? At the core, they are. And then they're led to put them into action. The mass line recognizes that often people don't act in their own interests. But the answer to this isn't just to get people to obey and follow your every word, but it's for them to make up their own minds based on truthful and sufficient information. The masses evaluate and select their leaders, but they also need to be educated about how to make the appropriate choice because God knows we've been backing some horrible fucking people. Now I'll end with a warning and a piece of advice. The warning? Don't let any of this get to your head. While leaders are important, their role should not be exaggerated. After all, it's the masses who end up doing the real work. A piece of advice. This shit is super difficult and takes a lot of practice. I feel like I'm still a little baby learning all of this, but it's the only way to make revolution and carry through revolution. Unless everybody with a stake in the ground understands the mass line, we're fucked. So be persistent, but be patient. Now before I let you go, be sure to check out the video on the mass line from the Peace Report. It's a shorter and more compact version. I know I just threw a lot at you, so I think it'll be good to hear again in a condensed form by a dope ass comrade. His channel is fire, so check him in the video out, link in description. And if you're ready to do some actual reading, I suggest checking out a piece by Scott H. on the mass line and the American Revolutionary Movement. Read it and you'll see how much I took from that piece to make this video. It's really amazing. Link for that in the description as well. And on that dramatic note, peace, Space Baby out.